The interview was flowing normally. Then Sammy Davis Jr. leaned forward and whispered 3 words to Johnny Carson, and that moment became one of the most powerful in television history. It was March 1982. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B in Burbank, California. Another Thursday night. The monologue had gone well. The audience was warm. Ed McMahon was laughing in all the right places. Doc Severinsen and the band were swinging through their usual excellence. Sammy Davis Jr. was the guest. A Tonight Show regular. He'd been on the show dozens of times over the years. He and Johnny had an easy rapport, the kind of comfortable friendship that comes from years of shared stages and mutual respect. Sammy walked out to thunderous applause, hugged Johnny, shook Ed's hand, settled into the orange guest chair with that characteristic energy. He was promoting a news show in Vegas. They talked about his recent performances. The conversation was light, funny, exactly what America expected when they tuned in at 11:30 p.m. Everything was routine. Everything was safe. Everything was going exactly according to script. Until it wasn't. They were maybe 8 minutes into the interview. Johnny had just asked Sammy about working with Frank Sinatra. Sammy was mid-answer, gesturing with his hands, when something shifted in his expression. His smile faded slightly. His eyes focused on Johnny with sudden intensity. "Johnny," Sammy said, interrupting his own story, "can I tell you something?" Johnny leaned back slightly, sensing the tone change. "Of course." Sammy glanced at the audience, then at the cameras, then back at Johnny. He leaned forward in his chair, closing the distance between them. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, more intimate, as if he'd forgotten they were on live television. "I know what happened last month," Sammy said. "And I need you to hear something." Johnny's face changed. The professional host's mask slipped. His smile disappeared. His hand moved to grip the edge of his desk. Carson stopped mid-conversation. The entire studio froze. The control room erupted into confusion. Director Bobby Quinn leaned into his headset. "What's happening? Did we lose audio? Why did Johnny stop talking?" Producer Fred de Cordova stood behind him, watching the monitors. "Keep rolling," Fred said quietly. "Something's happening." On stage, Johnny hadn't moved. Sammy was still leaning forward, his eyes locked on Johnny's face. The audience sensed a shift, that invisible change in atmosphere when television stops being performance and becomes real. Ed McMahon, sitting at his desk beside Johnny, had stopped smiling. He was watching both men with an expression of concern and recognition. "Sammy," Johnny said, his voice careful, controlled. "We don't need to." "Yes, we do," Sammy interrupted gently. "Johnny, everyone in this business knows. Everyone who cares about you knows. And I need to say this to you because—" He paused, choosing his words. "Because you saved my life once. And you don't even know it." The audience was completely silent. 300 people holding their collective breath. Johnny's jaw tightened. "Sammy, this isn't—" "Please," Sammy said. "Let me say this." Johnny nodded slowly, his hand still gripping the desk. "To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 1 month earlier." Johnny Carson's mother had died in February 1982. Ruth Carson. She was 88 years old. She'd lived a long life, raised 4 sons in Nebraska during the Depression, survived her husband by 15 years. By all accounts, she'd had a good death, peaceful, surrounded by family, no prolonged suffering. But Ruth Carson had also been a difficult woman. Cold, critical, emotionally distant. She'd never told Johnny she was proud of him. Not when he got his first radio job. Not when he started hosting The Tonight Show. Not when he became the most famous television personality in America. Johnny had spent his entire career, his entire life, really, trying to win her approval. Every joke, every show, every success was partially motivated by the hope that maybe this time, maybe this accomplishment would be enough to make his mother say she loved him. She never did. The funeral had been small. Private. Johnny didn't miss any shows. He came back to work 3 days later and did his monologue like nothing had happened. Because that's what Johnny Carson did. He performed. He made America laugh. He kept his personal pain locked away where it couldn't interfere with his job. But people who knew him well, Ed McMahon, Fred de Cordova, a few close friends, noticed the change. Johnny was drinking more. Sleeping less. His jokes had a harder edge. The smile didn't reach his eyes. He was drowning, quietly, in a grief he couldn't name. Not just grief for his mother's death, but grief for the relationship they'd never had. For the words she'd never said. For the approval that would now never come. Sammy Davis Jr. had heard about Ruth Carson's death. He'd sent flowers to the funeral. He'd called Johnny's house and left a message of condolence. But he hadn't mentioned it on the show. This was Johnny Carson's territory. You didn't bring up painful personal topics unless Johnny opened the door first. Until tonight. March 1982. When Sammy looked at his friend sitting behind that desk and saw something in Johnny's eyes that he recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror. The look of someone barely holding on. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Sammy Davis Jr. knew about difficult mothers. His own mother had abandoned him when he was 3 years old. He'd been raised by his father and uncle in vaudeville, performing since before he could remember. He'd spent his childhood searching for love and approval from audiences because he couldn't find it at home. He knew what it felt like to achieve everything, fame, wealth, respect, and still feel empty because the one person whose approval you needed most never gave it. He recognized that emptiness in Johnny. And he couldn't stay silent anymore. "Johnny," Sammy said, still leaning forward in the guest chair, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it." Johnny nodded, his throat tight, his eyes suspiciously bright under the studio lights. 10 years ago," Sammy continued, "I was in the worst place I'd ever been. This was 1972. My career was struggling. I was drinking too much. Using too much. I'd lost perspective on everything. And I was sitting in a hotel room in Vegas at 3 in the morning, seriously considering whether it was worth continuing." The audience gasped softly. This wasn't the kind of confession people made on talk shows in 1982. Mental health, addiction, suicidal thoughts. These topics lived in shadows, not under television lights. "And I turned on the TV," Sammy said. "And there you were. Doing your monologue. And you made a joke. I don't even remember what it was about, but it made me laugh. Really laugh. And then you did this bit with Ed, and I laughed again. And for those 15 minutes, I forgot how much pain I was in." Johnny's hand had moved from the desk to cover his mouth. His eyes were glistening. "You saved my life that night, Johnny," Sammy said, his voice cracking slightly. "You didn't know it. You were just doing your job. But you saved me. And I've never told you that." "Sammy," Johnny whispered, barely audible. "So now I need to tell you something else," Sammy continued. "Something I think you need to hear right now." He paused, took a breath, and then leaned even closer to Johnny, so close the microphones barely caught it. Close enough that it felt like a private conversation despite the cameras and the audience and the millions watching at home. And then Sammy Davis Jr. said 3 words. "You are enough." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny Carson broke. Not a small crack. Not a single tear politely wiped away. He broke. His hand dropped from his mouth to the desk. His shoulders shook. Tears streamed down his face. The man who had spent 30 years maintaining perfect composure on television, who had interviewed presidents and movie stars and maintained his professional distance through every emotional moment, completely fell apart. The control room went silent. Every camera operator, every technician, every person involved in making The Tonight Show stopped what they were doing and watched. Ed McMahon was crying too, not even trying to hide it. Doc Severinsen had set down his trumpet. The band was motionless. The audience sat in stunned, reverent silence. Sammy reached across the space between the guest chair and the desk and put his hand on Johnny's arm. Just held it there. Waiting. It took Johnny almost 30 seconds to compose himself enough to speak. When he did, his voice was raw, broken, nothing like the smooth, professional instrument America knew. "I needed to hear that," Johnny said. "You have no idea how much I needed to hear that." "I know," Sammy said gently. "That's why I said it." Johnny wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, then looked directly into the camera, something he rarely did during interviews. When he spoke, he was talking not just to Sammy, not just to the studio audience, but to every person watching at home. "My mother died last month," Johnny said. "And she never told me she was proud of me. Not once. I spent my whole life trying to be good enough, trying to achieve enough, thinking maybe if I just got a little more successful, a little more famous, maybe then." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Maybe then she'd love you," Sammy finished quietly. Johnny nodded, fresh tears rolling down his cheeks. "Yeah. But here's what I learned, Johnny," Sammy said. "The people who can't give us the love we need, that's not about us. That's about them. That's about what they didn't have to give. And you can't spend your whole life trying to earn something from someone who doesn't have it in them to offer." Johnny was listening, really listening, in a way he perhaps had never listened to anything before. "You are enough," Sammy repeated, each word deliberate, weighted with meaning. "Not because of this show. Not because of your success. Not because millions of people love you. You're enough because you exist. Because you're here. Because you matter. And your mother's inability to see that, that's her loss, Johnny. Not yours." But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny stood up. The audience gasped. Hosts didn't leave the desk during interviews. It wasn't done. Johnny walked around the desk, across the short space to where Sammy sat in the guest chair. Sammy stood to meet him. And then Johnny Carson, on live television, in front of millions of viewers, hugged Sammy Davis Jr. and held on like a drowning man holding a lifeline. The audience erupted. Not in applause, not yet, but in that collective sound of 300 people crying together. A release of emotion that had been building from the moment Sammy said those 3 words. Ed McMahon stood up from his desk, wiping his eyes. Doc signaled to the band, and they began playing softly, not the usual upbeat Tonight Show music, but something gentle, something that matched the sacredness of the moment. Johnny and Sammy stayed there, holding each other, for what felt like an eternity. When they finally separated, both men's faces were wet with tears. Johnny looked at Sammy, then at the audience, then back at Sammy. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for seeing me. For really seeing me." "Always, brother," Sammy said. "Always." The audience rose as one. Standing ovation. Not the excited applause of entertainment, but the quiet, powerful applause of people who had witnessed something that transcended television. Something real. Something healing. Johnny walked back to his desk slowly. He sat down, wiped his eyes one more time, and looked at the camera. "We're going to take a commercial break," he said, his voice still rough. "When we come back, well, I don't know what we'll do, but we'll figure it out together. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten." During the commercial break, Johnny told his producers to keep everything in the broadcast. All of it. The tears, the breakdown, the hug, everything. Don't cut a single second. People need to see this, Johnny said. I need them to see that it's okay to not be okay. That it's okay to need someone to tell you you're enough. When the show came back from commercial, Johnny and Sammy didn't continue with the planned interview. They just talked. About loss. About mothers. About the weight of expectations and the freedom of finally letting go. It was the most watched Tonight Show episode of 1982. The next day, Johnny received over 10,000 letters. People sharing their own stories of difficult parents, of seeking approval that never came, of finally learning they were enough. Johnny kept one item from that night in his desk drawer for the rest of his career. Not a cue card. Not a photograph. A simple piece of paper on which he'd written, in his own handwriting, 3 words. "You are enough." Sammy had given it to him after the show, during the commercial break, scrawled quickly on the back of a Tonight Show call sheet. "Keep this," Sammy had said. "Read it every day." And Johnny did. Every single day until his final show in 1992. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. When Johnny Carson died in 2005, his family found that piece of paper in his personal effects. It was worn from being handled, folded and unfolded countless times. On the back, in Johnny's handwriting, was a single addition. "Thank you, Sammy. You saved me too." The paper now sits in the Smithsonian, a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can tell someone is the simplest truth they've never heard.